as you can probably tell by how much I'm sweating, we're getting our first few warm days here in the mid-Atlantic, so I thought I'd spend the night out tonight. Now, despite what this background might have you believe, I'm actually not in the middle of the woods. This is my yard. There's a road right over there. You may hear some cars go by. My house is right that way. The reason I thought I'd stay so close to home is because I wanted to try out a really inexpensive kit that folks could use to sort of dip their toes into historic trekking or medieval-inspired camping, whatever you want to call this weird hobby that I'm involved in. And so I'm going to be using sleeping gear that I picked up at Harbor Freight for about $30. So what I've got here is my bedroll. I've been carrying it by a tump line that I made out of some sisal. I did a chain sinnet on this to make it, I wouldn't say more comfortable, but a little less aggressive while I'm carrying it. I wouldn't recommend doing this for long distances, though. So this bedroll is made up of a 6x9 painter's tarp that I'm going to be using as a shelter. I've got my wool tunic and my wool hat in case I need it tonight. I don't know that I will. It's supposed to be pretty mild. What they call a wool blend cover at Harbor Freight, but I'm going to be using it as bedding. And some guy lines and some plastic utility stakes. Now, the only thing that I've done to this painter's tarp is I washed it and dried it as hot as I could to try to shrink up the weave a little bit. And I made one other small modification that I'll talk about in a little bit. But in order to use this as a shelter, I need some tie-off points so I can guy it out. And I haven't added those. And so that's why I picked up those rocks that you saw me collect by the stream. So what I'm going to do is in each corner, I'm going to take a rock, bundle it up in the corner of the tarp, and then tie it off like this. And that'll give me a way to guide this out. I've got my tie-off points at all four corners now. And in a wooded area like this, I would probably just run a ridge line between two trees, throw the tarp over it, set up a, half wedge, and call it a day. But what if you're at an event or a campground where you don't have that option? I'm going to show you how to set up a freestanding tarp shelter using my walking stick. So the first thing you're going to want to do is stake out this back corner of your shelter. And since this is going to be only sheltered on two sides, you're going to want this pointing into the prevailing wind if you can manage it. So now I'm going to come over to the opposite corner from the one I just staked down, and I'm going to prop it up using my walking stick. And now we'll just stake out the other two corners. So now that we've got everything at least in place enough, we can go around and tighten everything up. But you'll notice we've got a fair amount of slack here. And you can still definitely lay underneath of it, but that's going to flap in the wind. It's going to collect water if it rains. So I told you that I made a small modification to the tarp, and I'm going to show you what I'm going to use that for. So what I've done in the center of the tarp is I've put this pair of ties. I've sewn these on. And what this will let me do with a Y branch is I can guy this out and take a lot of that slack out of the tarp. So I've got my tarp set up. As you can see, I can sit up in it and I'm still covered. So the next thing I need to do is prepare my bedding. So I'm going to make a debris bed. If you're in an area where there's not a lot of leaf litter, you'll probably want a camp pad of some sort. Something that's going to protect you from the ground. Okay, so hopefully that'll be enough. It's not supposed to get terribly cold tonight. It's not supposed to get cold at all. It's supposed to be in the 50s, but you still have to protect your core from the ground, which will suck the heat out of you. So what I've done is I've laid my blanket out on a diagonal, and that way I can flip the wings over me while I'm sleeping, but still have a layer underneath me. Alright, hopefully that'll work. Time to collect some firewood. So I've gone ahead and collected some firewood, but if you haven't noticed, it's been pretty windy today. So we're actually, we've got a red flag warning active, so I'm not going to be able to start a fire until after the sun goes down and the wind dies down a little bit. And so what I'll do is I'll prep everything, and then once it gets dark, I'll be lighting a fire with flint and steel in the dark, so we'll see how that goes.
Good morning. Sun's starting to come up. I didn't sleep as well as I would have liked, but I think it was mostly because my neighbors were being loud as opposed to anything wrong with the setup. Tarp worked well, shed the wind well. Blanket was a little small to use as a ground cover and a blanket, so for anything colder than it was last night, I'd really recommend having two of them because they're pretty thin. I stayed in just my linen tunic. I wanted to try this setup out with a really sort of minimal garb situation, you know, basic linen tunic, thrifted linen pants, surplus wool leg wraps. You know, I didn't want to supplement a basic setup with like a really elaborate soft kit. But overall, it worked out pretty well, I think. So one thing I did want to talk about briefly was when should you use a setup like this? So I don't think I would use this in the backwoods by myself, at least not without a lot of backup gear, like a emergency bivvy, emergency cover, something like that, in case this failed. I certainly wouldn't use it at a high authenticity focused event, especially one that had an educational element, because this wouldn't be appropriate for something like that. But for most American LARPs, for SCA events, for private gatherings where folks are working on things like this, doing some historic trekking, experimental archaeology, things like that. This would be fine. But as always, it's one of those things that you should check with your event organizer and see what their goals for the event are and whether or not a setup like this would work. So normally at this point, I would try to get this fire back up and going. Still some heat down in the embers, but we're actually in a burn ban right now. No burning between midnight and 4 p.m. So if I want coffee, I'm going to have to go inside. So I'm going to break everything down, head on in, make some coffee, start my day. So thank y'all for spending some time with me while I experimented with this setup. I hope it was informative. I hope it gave you some ideas for experimenting with your own setup.